Daniel Miller stood on the cusp of graduation, the culmination of 4 grueling years at Carnegie Mellon University, yet the anticipation he felt was heavily laced with a familiar, weary dread. The upcoming ceremony wasn't just a celebration of academic achievement. It was an obligatory performance before the family who had spent the better part of his 22 years making him feel like an awkward footnote in their own self-important narrative. The Millers of Pittsburgh were an aristocracy, not by a long shot, but they possessed a potent brand of suburban self-satisfaction, presided over by his father, Richard Miller. Richard was a man whose own stalled career in middle management seemed to fuel a perpetual disappointment in his younger son. Dan's quiet intelligence, his aptitude for the complex logic of computer science, was consistently dismissed as impractical, esoteric. Real world doesn't run on algorithms, Danny. Richard would scoff over Sunday dinner, waving away Dan's attempts to explain a challenging project. It runs on grit, salesmanship. Look at your brother Mark. Now that's a go-getter. Mark, 2 years older, worked in regional sales for a medical supply company. His successes, often modest and invariably amplified by their father, were family lore. Mark's closing of a mid-sized account warranted champagne. Dan acing an advanced calculus exam earned a grunt before Richard turned back to the sports page. Their sister Jessica, or Jess, occupied a different pedestal. Pretty, popular, working an unambitious administrative job she frequently complained about, Jess was nonetheless indulged, her whims catered to, her minor dramas treated with breathless concern by their mother Susan. Susan Miller existed in a state of anxious placation, forever smoothing ruffled feathers, usually Richard's or Jess's, and avoiding conflict at all costs. Her silence during Richard's dismissals of Dan felt like tacit agreement, a quiet reinforcement of Dan's perceived inadequacy. When Dan, as a teenager, had won a citywide math competition, Susan had offered a brief, nervous smile before quickly changing the subject to Jess's upcoming prom dress fitting. It wasn't malice, Dan understood, but a deep-seated aversion to rocking the established family hierarchy, where Mark was the heir apparent and Jess the indulged princess. Dan was other. The quiet one. The too serious one. The joke. That label had stuck early. While Mark played sports and Jess focused on social calendars, Dan had found refuge in books, computers, and a series of unglamorous part-time jobs he'd held since high school to save for college. He'd started at community college, working night stocking shelves at a grocery store, the smell of stale bread and cleaning fluid clinging to him when he stumbled home to study. He remembered Richard finding him hunched over coding homework at the kitchen table after a midnight shift. Still playing with those computers, huh? Mark's already hitting his sales targets this month. That's how you build a future, son, not clicking keys in the dark. Jess had wrinkled her nose. Oh, Danny, you smell like floor wax. Even when Dan transferred to CMU's prestigious computer science program, paying his own way through scholarships he fought tooth and nail for, federal loans, and continuing to work grueling hours, first washing dishes in a campus dining hall, then leveraging his growing skills into the late-night freelance coding gigs, their reaction was lukewarm. Carnegie Mellon? Richard had frowned. Expensive. Hope you know what you're doing. Don't come crying to me when those loans come due. Mark had clapped him on the back with false heartiness. Trying to join the big leagues, huh? Good luck. The underlying message was clear. Even this achievement was somehow suspect, likely beyond his grasp. Their casual disregard for his efforts, contrasted with their unquestioning support for Mark and Jess, became the furnace that forged Dan's secret ambition. He wasn't just studying for a degree. He was building an escape hatch. Every dollar earned from debugging code for a startup at 2 a.m., every expenditure meticulously tracked, every small investment made in a low-cost index fund, it was all fuel for a single burning goal, complete financial independence. He craved a space where their judgment couldn't reach him, a foundation built entirely by his own hands. The dream of owning his own home took root, becoming less a fantasy and more a strategic objective. While Mark bought new cars with parental help, and Jess lamented her tragically small wardrobe, despite frequent shopping trips funded by mysterious infusions from Susan's account, Dan lived frugally. He drove a sputtering decade-old sedan, wore clothes until they frayed, skipped nights out with classmates, his social life sacrificed at the altar of his escape plan. He learned to code faster, work smarter, sleep less. He saw the condescending pity in his siblings' eyes when he showed up to obligatory family dinners looking exhausted, the quiet disapproval from his father. He absorbed it all, letting it harden his resolve. He never asked them for a dime after that initial dismissive conversation about college costs. He navigated the complex FAFSA forms alone, secured his own loans, managed his meager budget with the precision of the algorithms he studied. His independence became his shield, his secret weapon. While they assumed he was struggling, barely scraping by, destined for a life as unremarkable as they perceived him to be, he was quietly, patiently building. Now, standing on the precipice of graduation, the degree itself felt almost secondary. The real achievement was the knowledge that he had done it utterly, completely alone, despite their indifference and low expectations. And nestled securely in the inside pocket of his worn blazer, waiting for the right moment, was the tangible proof. A set of newly cut keys. Keys to a small but meticulously renovated row house in Lawrenceville, purchased outright 2 weeks ago, with the accumulated earnings of years of silent, relentless work. Keys to his future, keys to his freedom. The only question was whether he could endure one last performance, one final act as the family joke, before the curtain fell on their assumptions forever. Graduation morning dawned over Pittsburgh, sunlight glinting off the three rivers, but for Dan Miller the brightness felt muted, filtered through a familiar lens of anxiety. He stood in his cramped, sparsely furnished student apartment near the University of Pittsburgh campus, the tangible proof of 4 years of relentless effort, his diploma frame waiting empty on the desk, warring with the heavy dread pooling in his stomach. Today was the culmination, the victory lap he'd earned through sheer grit, self-funding every credit hour, foregoing sleep for code, surviving on cheap ramen and fierce determination. And yet, the impending presence of his family threatened to cast a long, cold shadow over it all. He hadn't wanted to invite them. Years of their casual dismissals, their low expectations, their comparisons to his siblings Mark and Jess had taught him that sharing his successes with them inevitably led to diminishment, not celebration. But not inviting them would have triggered a different, equally exhausting round of drama. Accusations of ingratitude from his father Richard, tearful manipulations from his mother Susan about hurting the family. So he had sent the obligatory invitations, bracing himself for their obligatory, unenthusiastic attendance. Getting ready felt like preparing for battle, not a celebration. He pulled on his only suit, slightly worn at the elbows but clean and pressed. As he knotted his tie, his fingers brushed against the cool metal keys nestled in his inside blazer pocket. The keys to the renovated row house in Lawrenceville he'd closed on 2 weeks prior, the ultimate symbol of his hard-won independence. They felt heavy, both literally and figuratively, a secret anchor in the anticipated storm of family dynamics. He mentally rehearsed the polite, neutral responses he'd need, the deflective maneuvers to sidestep the inevitable barbs or backhanded compliments. He recalled past celebrations, the time he won that coding scholarship and Richard asked if it covered real-world skills, or when he made Dean's List and Mark joked about grade inflation in the CS department. Today would likely be no different. The cavernous Peterson Events Center buzzed with a joyous energy that felt alien to Dan. Graduates in black gowns milled about laughing, taking selfies, embracing tearful, beaming parents. Balloons bobbed, flowers perfumed the air. The sheer volume of collective pride and excitement was almost overwhelming. And then he saw them, already seated midway up the bleachers, an island of discordant energy in the sea of celebration. Richard sat stiffly, arms crossed, scanning the program with a look of profound boredom, occasionally checking his watch. Susan fidgeted with the strap of her purse, her gaze darting around nervously, avoiding eye contact with the celebrating families nearby. Mark, ever the important salesman, was leaning back, scrolling intently through his phone, while Jess beside him reapplied her lip gloss using her phone camera as a mirror, occasionally whispering something to Mark that made them both smirk. Their collective body language screamed obligation fulfilled, not proud family. Dan felt the familiar weary ache settle in his chest. Even here, on a day meant to honor years of his hard work, he was clearly an inconvenience, an interruption to their own self-absorbed orbits. He found his assigned seat among his fellow computer science graduates, exchanging nods and quiet congratulations with classmates. He tried to focus on the ceremony itself. The grand procession, the slightly pompous speeches from university dignitaries, the roll call of departments. He tried to savor the shared sense of accomplishment with his peers, the feeling of crossing a significant finish line together, but his awareness kept snagging on his family's section. He saw Richard stifle an obvious yawn during the dean's address. He saw Jess take multiple selfies, angling her phone to capture her own profile against the backdrop of the crowded arena. He saw Mark close his eyes for a long moment, clearly uninterested, They weren't even performing enthusiasm well. The contrast between the genuine celebration surrounding him and the black hole of indifference emanating from his own family was a chasm he felt acutely. The keys in his pocket seemed to press harder against his ribs. Finally, the moment arrived. Daniel Miller, Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, magna cum laude. His name echoed through the vast space. Polite applause rippled from the general audience, joined by more enthusiastic clapping from the faculty section and his departmental peers. He walked across the stage, shook the dean's hand, accepted the rolled diploma tied with university ribbon. As he turned, he caught the eye of Dr. Evans, his thesis advisor, who gave him a broad, genuine smile and a thumbs up. That small gesture of authentic pride from someone who respected his work felt more validating than anything he anticipated receiving from his family. For that fleeting moment on stage, holding the proof of his achievement, Dan allowed himself to feel the pure, unalloyed satisfaction of a goal hard won. Then came the walk back. Descending the stairs from the stage, the adrenaline of the moment receded, replaced immediately by the returning wave of dread as he navigated towards his family's seats. He could see them watching his approach, their expressions largely unchanged, perhaps a flicker of forced politeness now that his specific obligation was fulfilled. He took a deep breath and thus clutching the diploma, feeling the weight of the keys in his pocket like a counterbalance. This was it. The point where the official ceremony ended, and the familiar family performance, their lukewarm acknowledgement, his polite acceptance, was supposed to begin. But today felt different. Today, he held more than just a diploma. Dan navigated the throng of departing graduates and beaming families, the diploma clutched tightly in his hand, feeling strangely unreal. He reached the aisle where the Millers were already gathering their belongings, clearly eager to leave now that the main event was over and their obligatory presence fulfilled. Mark clapped him on the shoulder with false heartiness, already turning away. "Hey, congrats, man. Good job sticking it out." Jess offered a tight, dismissive smile. Yeah, Danny, a nice little scroll you got there." Susan murmured, "That's lovely, dear." Her gaze already drifting towards the exit, avoiding any real connection. Richard simply grunted, looking impatient. The diploma, representing 4 years of relentless, solitary effort, felt suddenly insignificant against the familiar wall of their indifference. Just then, Dr. Evans, Dan's thesis advisor, navigated through the crowd, his face beaming. "Daniel, excellent work! Magna cum laude in computer science! That's a tremendous achievement! Your family must be incredibly proud!" He directed his warm smile towards Richard and Susan. Susan managed a weak, fluttering smile in response. Richard offered a tight lip nod, his expression unchanging. As Dr. Evans moved on, congratulating another student, Richard leaned closer to Dan, ensuring Mark and Jess could hear, his voice a low sneer laced with familiar contempt. "Magna cum laude?" Richard scoffed, the words dripping with disdain. "Fancy Latin words don't pay the bills, Danny. Don't go getting a big head now." He paused, letting the cruelty land with practiced precision, his eyes glinting. "You're still the joke." Mark chuckled under his breath, a sound of shared derision. Jess covered her mouth, stifling a giggle, her eyes mocking Dan over her fingers. Susan flinched almost imperceptibly but remained silent, her gaze fixed steadfastly on her purse clasp, unwilling or unable to intervene. Nearby families, catching snippets of the exchange or just sensing the palpable tension, cast uncomfortable, curious glances their way before quickly looking away. The public nature of the insult, the sheer, unadulterated meanness of it delivered now, on this day, at this moment of his hard-won triumph, it sliced through Dan's carefully constructed defenses like a shard of ice. Something inside him didn't just break, it shifted. The years of swallowing their casual cruelty, of absorbing their low expectations, of internalizing their narrative of him as the family failure. It all suddenly felt distant. The familiar ache of hurt was still there, but it was overshadowed by a surge of cold, clarifying anger. Enough. No more polite deflections. No more pretending their words didn't wound. No more playing the part they had assigned him. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, a strange, unnerving calm settled over him. He straightened his shoulders, meeting his father's sneering gaze directly. Then, deliberately, he let his eyes travel across Mark's fading smirk, Jess's poorly concealed amusement, and finally, his mother's averted face. Slowly, purposefully, He reached into the inside pocket of his slightly worn blazer. His fingers closed around the cool, solid weight of the keys. He drew them out, two freshly cut brass keys gleaming on a simple steel ring. He held them up, catching the bright overhead lights of the arena, letting the metallic shine glint. He gave his hand a slight, almost imperceptible shake, and the soft jangle of the keys against each other cut through the low buzz of the dispersing crowd, creating a small pocket of focused silence around the Miller family. The effect was instantaneous. The laughter died on Mark's lips. Jess's smirk vanished, replaced by confusion. Susan finally looked up, her brow furrowed. Richard's sneer faltered, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the keys suspended in Dan's steady hand. The air thickened, the easy arrogance draining from their expressions, replaced by a dawning, uncertain stillness. The power dynamic, rigidly fixed for 22 years, palpably shifted in that silent moment. It was Richard who finally broke the tense silence, his voice rough, laced with suspicion. "What the hell are those, Daniel? Trying to show off your rusty old car keys?" Dan let the moment hang, savoring their confusion, their sudden uncertainty. Then he lowered his hand slightly, turning the keys over. "Oh, these?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "These unlock my new house." Jess snorted, a sharp, incredulous sound. "Yeah, right, Dan! You probably found those on the street. Last we heard, you could barely make rent on that shoebox apartment near campus." It was her go-to move, dismiss, belittle, reinforce his perceived failure, but this time Dan didn't let it land. He met her skeptical gaze calmly. "Not rent, Jess," he corrected, his voice level and firm. "My house. As in I bought it. Closed 2 weeks ago." He paused, letting the next part sink in. "Paid in full, no mortgage. Just my name on the deed." Utter silence descended upon the Miller contingent. He watched their faces, fascinated by the rapid play of emotions. Jess's mouth opened slightly, disbelief warring with something that looked almost like panic. Mark leaned forward almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowed in sudden, sharp calculation. Susan blinked rapidly as if trying to process information her brain couldn't categorize. "And Richard!" Richard's face flushed, the earlier sneer replaced by a look of profound, resentful shock. The foundation of their carefully constructed reality, the one where Dan was the perpetual screw-up, the family joke, had just developed a massive crack. They stared at the keys, then at Dan, as if seeing him for the first time, and clearly not liking the implications of what they were beginning to understand. He had achieved something substantial, something real, entirely outside their sphere of knowledge, influence, or control. And that, Dan realized with a surge of cold satisfaction, was utterly intolerable to them. The family stared at the keys, then back at Dan, a volatile mixture of disbelief and dawning resentment swirling in their eyes. It was Mark who recovered first, masking his shock with a familiar scoff. "Okay, Danny, cute prop, so you got keys made for something. Probably renting some fleabag studio in a sketchy part of town, trying to act like you finally made it." He laughed, a harsh, brittle sound, clearly trying to reassert the familiar dynamic, looking to Richard and Jess for backup. Dan just smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, Mark, no!" He calmly retrieved his phone from his pocket again, tapped the screen twice, and held it out, angling it so they could all see. Displayed was a crisp, clear photograph, a handsomely renovated brick row house on a tree-lined street in Lawrenceville, one of Pittsburgh's up-and-coming neighborhoods. It boasted clean lines, new windows reflecting the afternoon sun, and a small but impeccably neat front garden. It radiated solidity, pride of ownership. It was unequivocally not a dump. "Bought it outright last month," Dan stated conversationally. "Needed some work. Did most of it myself on weekends, but it's mine." The impact of the photograph was immediate and profound. Jess's eyes widened, raw jealousy flashing across her features before she could mask it. Susan gasped softly, her hand fluttering to her chest again. Mark's forced smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a tight-lipped, envious frown. "And Richard!" Richard's face contorted, the initial shock hardening instantly into a look of deep, ugly resentment. There wasn't a flicker of parental pride, not a single word of congratulations, only bitterness that the designated family failure had dared to achieve something tangible, something desirable, completely outside their sphere of influence and control. Dan saw it all with chilling clarity. This was their truth. They couldn't be happy for him. His success was an affront to their established narrative, a disruption to the hierarchy where he belonged firmly at the bottom. Fine. If they couldn't handle the simple truth of his hard-won success, then perhaps they were finally ready for the hidden truths underpinning their own precarious lives. The keys had unlocked their shock. Now it was time to unlock their secrets. The decision, simmering for years, crystallized in that moment of their unveiled resentment. His voice lost its conversational tone, taking on a sharper, more deliberate edge as he pocketed his phone and looked directly at his father. "Speaking of houses and finances, Dad," he began, "it's fascinating what you can uncover in public property records these days. For instance..." He paused, letting the casual tone contrast with the weight of his words. "That rather substantial home equity line of credit, $50,000, wasn't it? Taken out against the family home on Maple Street last winter?" Richard froze mid-scoff, the color visibly draining from his face. What are you talking about?" "Oh, you know," Dan continued smoothly. "The one filed with the Allegheny County Recorder's Office online?" "Clear as day. Second lien holder listed right there. Allegheny Trust Bank." "Funny thing is," he glanced pointedly at his mother, "Mom didn't seem aware of any HELOC when I was helping her sort through some tax documents a few months ago. Did you forget to mention it, Dad?" Susan whipped her head around, her eyes wide with confusion and rising panic. "Richard? Alone? Against our house? What is Daniel talking about?" Richard sputtered, his face now flushing a dangerous shade of red. That's private family business. It's none of your damn concern, boy. How dare you pry?" "Really?" Dan raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping ice. "Secretly encumbering the family home seems like everyone's concern, especially Mom's. Unless..." He let his gaze linger on his father. "There was a reason you needed $50,000 quickly and discreetly. Perhaps those investment club poker nights weren't just about cigars and camaraderie after all. Heard the stakes could get pretty high." Richard looked ready to physically lunge at him, speechless with impotent rage. Susan began shaking her head, whispering, "No, Richard, you didn't. Not again." Before Richard could explode, Dan smoothly pivoted his attention, turning his cold gaze onto his sister. "And Jess?" he said, his voice softening deceptively. Jess, who had been watching the exchange with wide, panicked eyes, flinched as if struck. "Always so stylish. It's impressive, truly, maintaining that lifestyle. The trips, the designer bags, the constant nights out, all on an administrative assistant's salary." "It's none of your damn business how I spend my money," Jess snapped, regaining a sliver of defiance. "Normally it wouldn't be," Dan agreed pleasantly. "Except it became my business when I helped Mom finally set up her online banking last year, remember? She kept mentioning quite sadly that her savings account, the one Dad's mother left her, never seemed to grow, despite her barely touching it." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Funny things, online transaction histories, especially when you filter them, like finding all those recurring monthly transfers from her savings account directly into your checking account for the past 2 years. Always small, irregular amounts, cleverly labeled loan repay, or misc reimburse, or gift repay. Very creative." He held up his phone again, displaying a neatly organized spreadsheet summarizing the withdrawals. "Adds up quickly, though, doesn't it, Jess? Looks like nearly $20,000 meticulously siphoned off." Jess gasped, reaching out instinctively as if to snatch the phone away. "That's a lie. They were loans. Gifts. Mom said I could borrow sometimes. She knew." Susan turned her tear-streaked, utterly horrified face towards her daughter. "My savings," she whispered, the words choked with disbelief. "The money from Grandma? Jessica, I never said... How could you?" As Jess dissolved into panicked sobs, trying desperately to deflect blame onto Dan for snooping and twisting things, Dan ignored her, his attention shifting with surgical precision to his older brother. Mark had been attempting to fade into the background, looking anywhere but at the unfolding family demolition. "And Mark," Dan said quietly, his voice drawing Mark's startled, panicked gaze, "you've been remarkably silent through all of this. Almost." Dan tilted his head slightly, as if none of this financial creativity is news to you. "What?" No exclamation mark, Mark blurted out, shaking his head too quickly. "I didn't know anything about..." Dan cut him off smoothly. Didn't you? Let's talk about last year, Mark. That rather significant $17,000 problem you had? The one stemming from that can't-miss crypto investment that went belly up? The one Dad absolutely refused to bail you out of? Dan let the question hang, watching the color drain from Mark's face. How did that rather large debt magically disappear off your books just a week or so later? He looked pointedly at Jess, still sobbing, then back at Mark. Funny timing, wasn't it? Happened right around the same time Jess made several significantly larger withdrawals from Mom's savings account. Mark went utterly white, looking trapped. Dan pressed gently. Did Jess bail you out, Mark? Using Mom's stolen money? And did you know where that money came from when you gratefully accepted it? Before Mark could stammer out a denial, Richard's fury, momentarily stunned by his own exposure, found a new, immediate target. He rounded on his older son, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You lost $17,000 on that crypto nonsense? After I explicitly forbade it? He then pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Jess. And you, his voice rose to a roar, paid off his gambling debts using money stolen from your mother? The fragile facade of the Miller family didn't just crack, it imploded. Richard was now yelling furiously at Mark, questions of business acumen mingling with accusations of complicity in theft. Susan, weeping uncontrollably, confronted Jess, demanding answers, lamenting her stolen inheritance. Jess, cornered, shrieked back, trying desperately to deflect blame onto Mark for getting into trouble, onto Dan for exposing her, onto anyone but herself. Mark stammered pathetic excuses, trying to defend himself to his enraged father while glaring daggers at Jess. They were no longer a united front dismissing Dan. They were a tangled, venomous knot of secrets, lies, and accusations, tearing each other apart in the middle of the crowded graduation hall, oblivious now to the stunned stares of strangers. Dan stepped back, figuratively and literally, watching the ugly spectacle unfold. The chaos was entirely of their own making, built on years of denial, entitlement, and disrespect. He had simply unlocked the doors they had kept hidden for far too long. For a long moment, Dan simply watched the ugly spectacle unfold, a detached observer of the familial implosion he had just detonated. Richard, his face contorted with fury, was roaring at Mark about betrayal, incompetence, and misused company funds, completely forgetting, it seemed, his own recently exposed secrets. Susan, weeping openly now, confronted Jess, her voice choked with horror and disbelief, demanding answers about her stolen inheritance, her trust shattered. Jess, cornered and panicked, shrieked denials mixed with tearful accusations, trying to deflect blame onto Mark for his initial debt, onto Dan for exposing her, onto anyone but herself. Mark, pale and stammering, attempted futilely to defend himself against his father's volcanic rage while simultaneously glaring venomously at Jess. The carefully maintained facade of the respectable Miller family had disintegrated into raw, ugly recrimination, right there under the bright lights of the graduation hall, surrounded by bewildered strangers. The focus, for the first time Dan could remember in any family conflict, wasn't on him. They were too busy tearing each other apart. He let their chaotic symphony of dysfunction rage for another minute, absorbing the raw display of their true natures, stripped bare of pretense. Then he took a deliberate step forward, clearing his throat loudly. The sudden sound cut through their furious argument, startling them. 4 pairs of eyes, tear-streaked, rage-filled, panicked, snapped back towards him, momentarily united again only by their shock at his interruption. Dan spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying an undeniable weight, a chilling finality that commanded their attention. Interesting, he began, his tone almost conversational, though his eyes remained cold as ice chips. All these years the narrative was always the same, wasn't it? Danny's the problem. Danny's the awkward one. Danny's the disappointment. He gestured vaguely towards the tangled knot of their accusations. Funny how it turns out that the real problems, the actual secrets and lies and betrayals, were festering right here in the heart of the family all along. He met his father's glare directly. You asked, or rather just demanded, why I'm doing this, he said, his voice steady. Why I didn't just take my diploma, accept your backhanded congratulations, and shuffle away quietly like I always do. He shook his head slowly. Because today was supposed to be different. Today was my achievement, earned without a shred of help or encouragement from any of you. And your response? He let his gaze sweep over them. Was to sneer, to chuckle, to dismiss, to remind me even now that in your eyes, I'm still the joke. Hearing that today, he continued, the words precise, measured, after everything, it clarified things. It made me realize you would never see me. You would never acknowledge my worth or respect my accomplishments because my success fundamentally challenges the roles you assigned me, the narrative you need to believe about yourselves. His voice hardened slightly. You couldn't be proud today. You couldn't even manage a polite indifference. Your immediate reaction to proof of my success. He patted the blazer pocket where the keys rested. It wasn't happiness, it was resentment, jealousy, bitter disbelief that the family joke could possibly achieve something real without your permission or control. So, Dan stated, his voice dropping again, becoming dangerously quiet, I decided it was time you all faced some other truths, the uncomfortable ones you've kept carefully hidden while projecting all your own failures and dysfunctions onto me. He ticked them off mentally. The truth about Dad's private business and secretly risking Mom's financial security. The truth about Jess's designer lifestyle being funded by systematic theft from her own trusting mother. The truth about Mark's unlucky debts and his willing complicity in covering them up with stolen money. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture of finality. This mess? He said, indicating the emotional wreckage surrounding them. This implosion? This isn't my creation. This is the inevitable consequence of the reality you built together, the one you hid behind facile smiles and public appearances while making me the designated scapegoat. A small, humorless smile touched Dan's lips. It wasn't amusement. It was the grim satisfaction of a long-held truth finally spoken. You know what's truly ironic? Your constant dismissal, your predictions of my failure, your absolute certainty that I'd amount to nothing without Sterling. He corrected himself mentally, sticking to his Miller identity. Without family help. That was the best motivation I ever could have asked for. It fueled every late night I spent coding, every extra shift I picked up, every single dollar I saved towards my escape. I didn't achieve what I have because of this family, he stated, the words ringing with conviction. I achieved it in spite of you. He straightened to his full height, his posture radiating a strength they had never acknowledged. You called me the joke? He glanced deliberately at their shocked, ravaged faces, then briefly at the curious onlookers nearby, who were trying not to stare too obviously. Look around now. Take a good look. He let the question hang in the charged air. Who's really the joke here? He paused, then added quietly, decisively, more importantly, who's walking away free? He addressed them collectively one last time, his voice devoid of the earlier cold anger, settling now into a tone of detached finality. Don't call me, he instructed calmly. Don't text. Don't show up at my door asking for financial help, emotional support, or anything else related to cleaning up the disaster you've just uncovered amongst yourselves. You. He looked pointedly at Richard, then Jess, then Mark, his gaze lingering briefly on Susan's tear-streaked face, are entirely, completely on your own now. He held their stunned gazes for a final second. Enjoy dealing with your own choices. And with that, Daniel Miller turned his back on the wreckage of his family. He didn't wait for their sputtering responses, their inevitable accusations, or their pleas. Head held high, diploma clutched in one hand like a hard-won trophy, the keys a solid, reassuring weight in his pocket. He walked purposefully down the aisle, away from the stage, away from the judgment, away from the suffocating weight of their expectations. He ignored the curious stares and muffled whispers that followed him. He felt strangely light, almost buoyant, as if shedding a heavy, invisible cloak he'd unknowingly worn his entire life. The humid Pittsburgh air outside the auditorium doors felt fresh, clean, breathable in a way it never had before. The performance was over. The cage door had been thrown open. He was free. Dan walked out into the bright, chaotic afternoon of the Pittsburgh campus, the heavy auditorium doors closing behind him, muffling the sounds of the continuing ceremony and the distinct, unpleasant echoes of his family imploding. His phone immediately began vibrating in his pocket, a furious, insistent buzzing. He didn't need to look to know who was calling, whose frantic texts were piling up. Brenda, Richard, Mark, Jess. The frantic energy of their self-inflicted catastrophe, trying desperately to pull him back into its orbit. With a calm deliberation that felt foreign yet deeply satisfying, he pulled out the phone, silenced the ringer, and dropped it back into his pocket without glancing at the screen. Their panic was no longer his problem. Their chaos was not his to manage. His role in the Miller family drama, the one they had written for him, was officially concluded. The drive across town to Lawrenceville felt different this time. He noticed architectural details on buildings he'd passed countless times before, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves of late spring trees lining the streets, the intricate ironwork on an old bridge. It was as if a heavy gray filter had been lifted from his perception of the world, a filter composed of years of anxiety, resentment, and the constant draining effort of managing his family's expectations and dismissals. He felt lighter, his shoulders less tense, breathing more easily despite the lingering humidity. He wasn't just driving away from the graduation ceremony. He was driving away from a lifetime of feeling less than. He was driving home. Pulling up to the curb outside the renovated brick row house, his house, felt like docking in a safe harbor after navigating a treacherous storm. He took a moment, just sitting in his old sedan, looking at it. The clean lines of the new windows he'd installed himself, the deep blue gloss of the front door he'd painstakingly painted, the small planter boxes on the steps waiting for flowers. It wasn't a mansion like the Sterlings might inhabit, but it was solid, well-built, and most importantly, utterly, completely his. Bought with funds earned through his own intellect and relentless effort, renovated with his own two hands on countless weekends when his family assumed he was just tinkering with computers. He got out of the car, walked up the steps, and slid his new key into the lock. The satisfying click as the deadbolt retracted resonated more deeply than any applause had back in the auditorium. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind him, shutting out the noise of the city, the imagined noise of his family's frantic calls, the real noise of their lifelong dismissal. The interior was clean, sparsely furnished with second-hand pieces he'd collected, but filled with the potential of a new beginning. Sunlight streamed through the tall front window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and falling across the polished hardwood floors he'd spent weeks refinishing. The faint, clean smell of paint lingered. It was quiet, deeply, profoundly quiet. It was peace. It was safety. It was his. He walked into the modest living room and carefully placed the diploma, still rolled and tied with university ribbon, on the simple wooden mantelpiece above the fireplace he planned to eventually restore. He went into the small, functional kitchen, took the house keys from his pocket, and set them down on the clean granite countertop. The metallic clink seemed to echo slightly in the stillness. He stood there for a long moment, just breathing, looking around, letting the reality sink in. Ownership, sanctuary, independence. Standing by the front window, looking out at the quiet, tree-lined street, Dan took the first truly deep, uncomplicated breath he felt he'd taken in years. The relief washed over him, not in a sudden wave, but as a slow, steady taut, loosening knots of tension he hadn't even realized he carried. It wasn't just about the house or the degree, or even the final explosive confrontation. It was about the severing of invisible chains, the reclaiming of his own narrative, the validation that came not from their approval, but from his own hard-won self-sufficiency. His phone, resting on the kitchen counter, suddenly buzzed again, the vibration sharp against the granite. He glanced over. The screen lit up. Mom's cell. Susan. Of course. Predictable as sunrise. He watched it buzz, the insistent digital plea cutting through the quiet peace he'd just begun to savor. He pictured her face. Tearful, pleading, manipulative, trying to draw him back into the chaos, back into the role of the fixer, the absorber of their dysfunction. A flicker of old habit, a vestigial pang of pity for her trapped position between Richard's ego and her children's entitlement, tugged at him for the briefest second. Then clarity returned, cold and absolute. Engaging now would solve nothing. It would be a betrayal of the boundary he had just fought so hard to establish. It would signal that their tactics still worked, that he was still susceptible. For his own sanity, for the clean future stretching before him in this quiet house, the line had to remain firm. With calm finality, Dan walked over, picked up the phone, and pressed the decline button. Then methodically he opened his contacts. Richard Miller, block. Susan Miller, block. Mark Miller, block. Jessica Miller, block. Done. Silence descended once more, deeper this time, unbroken. Dan looked around his quiet house, his sanctuary. It wasn't filled with the weight of family history or unspoken resentments, just the light of the afternoon sun and the promise of a future he could build on his own terms. He felt the profound exhaustion of the day, the culmination of years of struggle, settle over him, but beneath it lay a solid foundation of peace, unlike anything he had ever known. He walked towards the kitchen, thinking about making himself some dinner, maybe ordering a celebratory pizza to eat right here on the floor of his very own living room. Simple choices. His choices. The future felt blessedly, terrifyingly, wonderfully open, finally free from the crushing weight of being the family joke. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, and began to unpack the few boxes he'd managed to bring over earlier that week.